All right. Welcome, everyone, again, in person and online, or via the recording, I should say. Today, we're going to look at stress and stress management. And it's obviously a very broad topic. So we're going to actually look at the role that stress plays in performance. For one of you guys, for those of you guys, sorry, that that did the Stress Less Challenge, some of this information will be familiar to you, but we'll go a little bit more in depth and specific to how stress affects us to be able to operate kind of at our best. And so, one of my favorite facts around the concept or even the etymology of stress is that it didn't start being used as in reference to human beings until about the 1980s, when researchers look back and see how language was used, mainly through media, especially print media. The word stress up until about the early 80s was only used in reference to machinery. So that when like a part of a machine or a machine itself got overly stressed, it was then at risk of breaking. And only in the 80s did it start becoming relevant and start getting used and utilized in reference to humans. That doesn't mean that obviously stress started in the 80s, but we can, it's not hard to see and to sense how the kind of how complicated and how varied our modern lives are, how much more likely we are to suffer and experience stress these days. Another thing I want to make early on in the talk is that stress isn't always bad, that stress can actually be a very useful and very good thing for any of us that have ever either studied or at work had some sort of project or thing they had to get done. A deadline and the stress that that creates actually motivates us to be able to do it. And so it's also a bit of a motivator. You would have heard Sam talk about occasionally how cortisol is, even though it's known as a stress hormone, it's also the thing that gets us moving. And so stress is actually important in getting us to be able to be active and engaged, but yet too much, very much can tip us over the edge. From a psychological perspective, there are four main types of stress, especially recognized from I guess like a psychometric measurement perspective. We have biological, which is our sympathetic nervous system. So this is our fight or flight response, the elements of our nervous system that is I guess triggered and then responds with a stress response. We have emotional stress, so fear and anxiety. We have behavioral, which is the act of running away from a threat or some sort of behavior that we may do as a result of stress. And we have cognitive stress, which is the perception of a threat, which is a really important one in our modern world. And so these four types often happen at once. So to give you an example, you might be at work, all of a sudden a client changes a deadline that you had to work towards, or maybe something unexpected happens. This creates a sense of fear and anxiety. A sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive, so the biological and the emotional side of things that are both enacted there. Our heart rate increases, we have sharper breathing, our pupils will dilate. And then maybe we either get something done, we freak out, we yell at a colleague or something along those lines. So that's like that's the behavioral element of it. And so it can be useful to separate them, but odds are they do happen all at once. And just as a little bit of a bit of a focus or a bit of a zoom in, the cognitive element, the perception of a threat is particularly relevant in our modern lives, because what happens is if our nervous system is a little bit more overwrought, a little bit more stressed than it needs to be or than is ideal, our cognitive perception of a threat and our likelihood of that is going to be far greater. I often use this example because I think we've all been there at some point where you might feel as though you're at your wit's end and maybe your kid does something, something happens with a partner, you get a certain email and that tips you over the edge. That because our nervous system is so frayed already, our perception of a threat or what is a threat is no longer particularly accurate. So one of our kids acting the way we don't want them to, or an email coming in allows or causes our nervous system to react in the same way that it would biologically and evolutionarily if we see a tiger or a lion hiding in the bushes. So fight, flight, or freeze. And so much of our I guess, our work when it comes to stress and stress when it comes to performance is how do we mitigate our ability to, sorry, how do we mitigate how much stress we are absorbing, and what can we do that's going to help manage stress when it inevitably happens? And so the autonomic nervous system is split between essentially two elements, parasympathetic and sympathetic. There's a really easy way to test which one you're in at any one time. So you could do this at home. You can do this essentially whenever. If you close your eyes and you take about 5 slow breaths, odds are either your inhale or your exhale is going to feel slightly easier. And so our inhale, as it's a little bit more engaging, you'll notice that if when you take your breath, that the air is actually slightly cooling against your nostrils. That's our sympathetic element. So that's the one that is in charge a little bit more of stress, a little bit more of activation. Our parasympathetic is our exhale, that sense of relaxing. There's a teaching in the sort of tradition of yoga that the breath is actually a microcosm of existence, that everyone is born on an inhale and every one of us dies on an exhale. And so the inhale is in charge of life and the exhale is actually the element of death. That the inhale is what kind of enlivens us and excites us and brings new, fresh energy into our system. And our exhale is what we release. That is what we release and how we release that which we no longer need. And so when you take your 5 or 6 breaths, whichever one you find a little bit easier, the odds are you're more in that state of your nervous system. So inhale, you'd be a little bit more fight or flight, exhale, a little bit more rest and digest. With our modern world, it's assumed that that a lot of us are operating at a point of almost 80% of our time in our sympathetic nervous system. So our slightly more stress or our more stress response. Now, when it's necessary, that isn't a bad thing, but when it is overacted and when that is too consistent and when that becomes actually closer to our center point, that's when we begin to increase likelihoods of illness, when we are more likely to burn out, when we're more likely to be exhausted. Those things begin to happen in a way that we can't necessarily control. And they are all results of an overloaded nervous system and too much stress. And so another thing that's interesting to note as something to be conscious of is that we actually, as herd animals, essentially as creatures that live in communion with each other, we actually catch stress from other people. And so even if you're not stressed yourself, if you're in an environment where you notice other people being stressed, and even if it's not conscious, your body recognizes, your senses recognize shoulders that are too tight, faces that are clenched, jaws that are clenched, faces that seem stressed, tone of voice, the pupils in each other's eyes, and those sort of things, all these signs of stress, and our body will actually begin to mimic other bodies that are in a stress state. And so it becomes even more important to be aware of what our individual triggers are, and to recognize what it feels like when our body is in a stress response so we can begin to move it out of it. And so if that's all essentially what stress looks like, I think we know that the adverse effects of stress can be great and quite wide-ranging. Things like poor sleep, immune system dysfunction, general inflammation. The big one that I know we talk about quite a lot at Fifth is also poorer lifestyle choices. And so if we're more exhausted and more stressed, we're going to begin to naturally gravitate towards things that make us feel better, easier. One of my biggest triggers, or I guess ways in which I notice if I'm more stressed than I need to be or than I want to be, is I'll start craving foods that are worse for me. And so if I'm a bit more exhausted and a bit more tired, I'm going to be more likely to reach for a burger or a pizza than I am something that I would probably normally eat on a more regular basis, because through that food, I'm getting a quick dopamine and quick serotonin hit. It isn't long lasting, but it begins to feel as though it's counteracting the excess cortisol in my system. And so we all kind of, for some people, it might be lots of coffee. For other people, it might be alcohol. It could be some form of behavior. It might be hours in front of the TV because we just want to switch off. Beginning to recognize what our individual manifestations of stress are goes a long way in helping us understand how we can be when we are stressed, and then how we can begin to combat it. One last thing on the effect of stress is that these days, the five main out of the five biggest killers from the Australian Medical Department, or five most likely ways in which an individual will die, are all now stress related, whereas in the 90s none of them were. So if I can find my little note where it actually has them here. Heart disease, COVID is actually the one that in the last year is not necessarily stress related, but heart disease, dementia, lung cancer, and lung disease, and cerebrovascular disease are all seen as stress related and behavioral, and have their links and have their roots in stress behavior. And so 15 years ago, none of those were in the top 5 killers, and now they all are, which is a very interesting thing to note in terms of how our culture operates and how we actually can, through preventative measures like we do at Fifth, really improve our sense of longevity and our sense of life. So, what can we do about it? And how can we help manage stress? How can we make a difference in supporting ourselves and our well-being for the long term? The most relevant thing is preventative measures. One of the things I see a lot when I work with people, and I think is quite common in a lot of people's life, is often we won't do anything about stress until we're at our wit's end, opposed to doing something about it on a regular basis to reduce the likelihood of getting overstressed or getting burnt out. Many quite often will wait until it's almost too late and we have to work backwards and against the grain. And so taking preventative measures with our health is one of the absolute best ways to, I guess, safeguard ourselves against the compounding effects of stress. One of the easiest ways to think about stress or negative stress is stress occurs when our resources, stress occurs when our capability is outweighed by our experience of life. And so when our capability is being outweighed by what is demanded of us, that is when stress begins to happen. And so as we increase our individual capacity, the odds are we're going to become less stressed. And so in terms of the 4 pillars of health that I always talk about, and I feel are very much embedded in Fifth Element as well, nutrition, exercise, sleep, and meditation. And when I say meditation, I'll say active restoration instead of solely meditation. So we could talk about elements of yoga in that. There could also be stretching, sauna, a lot of the things we talked about in the Stress Less Challenge. And so how can we begin to increase our capacity so stress is less likely to happen? Well, essentially, the more effort and the more time we put into those 4 things and helping us make healthy choices, the less likely it is that stress is going to occur. The more balanced we are with our nutrition, making good, healthy choices, with consistent exercise, with making sure we're getting enough sleep, and we're doing active restoration, it is far less likely that we will begin to experience the effects of stress. Our nervous system is essentially the exact same as it was 200,000 years ago, when we were hunter-gatherers, when we didn't have internets, where we could see everything that was bad happening in the world, where we weren't faced with the same level of financial stress or existential stress that we may be with today, when we weren't expected to be on our phones and emails all the time and consistently accessible by lots of different people. We had a very sort of controlled and quite insular life until about 100 years ago, or maybe 200 years ago. We saw the same people, we operated and did the same things, we had a very particular role. Now we're expected to wear many hats whilst questioning very many things that we've taken for granted for long times as human beings. All of that creates a layer and level of stress that our nervous system was not necessarily designed to deal with. And so when I talk to people about stress, one of the main things I say is, of course, we're stressed. We are not designed to be living the life in the way that we are today. And so we need to have new ways of being able to cope and to be able to deal with life in a way that actually benefits us and that is consistently moving the dial in a positive direction. And so, as a few of you may have heard me say at fifth, kind of ad nauseum, excuse my hay fever's a bit bad in springtime in Japan, is active recovery is probably your best friend when it comes to stress. Taking time in the sauna, taking time meditating, taking time stretching, going for walks, spending time in that sort of zone 2 movement, as well as time in nature, are all ways that genuinely replenish our nervous system, and not just replenish it, but actually begin to release stress from our system. And so there is one thing in not accumulating more stress, but actually beginning to release stress is also a way that really makes a very big difference to our life and to our performance. So saunas helps release infrared saunas helps release cortisol. Zone 2 movement actually begins to release cortisol as well. Time in nature has been proven, without them necessarily knowing why, to reduce heart rate, reduce blood pressure, do lots of things that have a stress releasing effect on our systems. And meditation is another big one where, again, on the stress less challenge, you guys would have heard me talk about this. But through multiple studies, they actually see the areas of our brain that begins to grow through meditation. And so through 6 weeks of meditating 15 minutes a day, in a certain study they did in the States, they noticed that the gray matter in our cingulate cortex actually grew by about 15%. Now, the cingulate cortex is the part of our brain that is the kind of central control unit for emotional and behavioral regulation. And so just through meditating, you're literally increasing the mass, the cellular mass of the part of your brain that helps you regulate your emotions and behavior. And so as we begin to learn more of these things, we begin to have the option to make really positive choices that are going to holistically and consistently build our stress resilience and help us build our stress resilience, so stop us accumulating more stress and begin to release the stress that is inherently in our systems. And a couple of considerations just before I sort of wrap it up again. This could be a kind of 3-day workshop that I'm essentially putting into about 15 or 20 minutes worth of talking. And as always, if there's stuff of this you'd like to learn more about or some resources or whatever it is, please reach out to me via the app or via my email that Ellen always puts. Just a couple of considerations I think are really important. The number one that I think is relevant to all of us, and it's very relevant to me, is that like attracts like. So generally speaking, if we're more active and more stressed, we are more likely to choose activities that maybe feel good, but probably are increasing our levels of stress. The easiest example is the most likely people to go to an F45 or body fit 5 times a week are probably people that are working 45 hours. That there's something in the activity, in the movement, in the intensity of it that our nervous systems are familiar with. We're more likely to seek it out. And so those of us that are resistant to doing restorative things are probably the people that need it most. In the same way that often those of us that are resistant to doing slightly more active and engaged activities probably need those most. As a yoga teacher, I often see that the people that come to yin yoga 5 times a week are probably the ones that would benefit more from doing a slightly faster class, whereas all those that are very dedicated to going to the faster classes probably need some yin. It's just kind of how our brains and how our sort of beings operate, that we tend to go towards things that we feel more comfortable with. And so if you notice that you're more likely to do more energizing and engaging activities, it might be worthwhile looking at some more recovery and more restoration. Making time for active recovery for really everyone in our modern world is so fundamental to our well-being. Me and Sam often talk about this idea that life is essentially your management of your parasympathetic nervous system. Our lives these days are stressful, engaged, active, tiring. And so how much we can do to support the more restful part of our nervous system goes so far in increasing our well-being. Thinking about small steps. So things like if you're looking to a meditation practice, starting with 5 minutes a day is going to be much more likely than trying to do 30 minutes every single day. If you've never really done any active recovery or stress management, then putting some genuine time aside in the same way that you schedule a time with your trainer at Fifth, how can you schedule a time for a sauna or a yoga class or a walk, is a really big thing as well. It will be uncomfortable at the start, generally speaking. Doing things that are a little bit slower, that require more active stillness and active recovery, generally will feel a bit challenging. There's a great study they did in Harvard where at about, I think it was a couple of hundred participants, that 85% chose to shock themselves with electricity at a very high voltage, opposed to sitting in a dark room by themselves for 10 minutes. Because that mental activity and those layers of stress, we don't necessarily like to be faced with. But what I say to most of my clients and people I work with through a yoga perspective as well is, if not now, when? That we don't need to wait for burnout. We don't need to wait for some serious illness, that we can actually make these steps now so we don't get to that really horrific and really challenging endpoint and have to work ourselves all the way back from rock bottom, that we can actually make it part of our day-to-day routine, or at least week-to-week routine, so that we feel more capable, conscious, and steady as a result. And through that, enjoy our lives more without the sort of perennial cloud of stress hanging over our heads. And I think that, again, Fifth is really at the forefront with doing this sort of thing. And that making the time and taking the effort to do that goes so far in increasing your well-being. And from a performance perspective, which I didn't touch on as much as I probably thought I would, our results actually begin to improve as we release and mitigate the effects of stress, as some of you may have already noticed. Yeah, like I said, this could be a 3-day retreat, so I'll leave it there for our chat. Just a quick opportunity if any of the guys that are live would like to ask a question or maybe add something in.
That sorry, can you hear me, Ziggy?
Yeah, I can.
Well done, by the way. I can hear how stuffed up you are with your hay
Sorry,
fever.
yeah. It wasn't bad until I started talking, and it got a lot worse.
I think that the idea of mimicking stress is really interesting, because I work in an emergency department, and on the outside I'm really, really, really calm, and people often comment on that. But when I did the Stress Less challenge with Fifth, I realized I carry an awful lot of stress, and I realized that when I tried doing the meditating. And then with COVID and lockdowns, and I live alone and I'm single, that I couldn't be at home without something playing in the background, like television on or a podcast, to combat the loneliness. And that idea of just being alone with my thoughts was really terrifying. And so I'm trying to actively do that now, and it's good, but it's hard. So I did a sauna yesterday, and I sat there for 30 minutes instead of having my earbuds in and listening to a podcast, I just sat there for 30 minutes with my thoughts. It felt like 3 hours, but I'm glad I did it. It caused me just to stop and reflect and think, because I've got that stress of work that I didn't realize I was carrying until recently.
Yeah, I say this all the time to people, more in the yoga space than anything else, that we're the only person that we are guaranteed to live with every second of our lives. And so doing things where we're actually okay with what's happening in here, or at least aware of what's happening in there, and forming that relationship, is really the role I think that yoga and meditation are there to play. Like, I don't think that yoga is there to make us more fit or more flexible or stronger or anything. There's way better ways to do that, but about cultivating an inner relationship and a way in which we can be with ourselves in a degree of comfort and a degree of ease and happiness. That is fundamental, because when that is established, it makes our ability to connect with others a lot more easy, and it allows us to connect with the world in a very different way as well. Mm. So yeah, I'm really glad that you're doing that. And like I said before, guys, for those of you that are rewatching, always feel free to reach out and ask me a little bit more about this stuff, because at the start it can be a little bit daunting, especially maybe like a meditation practice or a more stillness-based practice. And I've been doing this for years and have heard most stories that you could imagine and experienced a lot of them myself. So I'm always here to to help and to advise, or maybe point in a direction, or help you go through something that that you may need, especially from a stress-based perspective. But I'll leave it there, and hopefully hear from some of you, and otherwise I'll be back in about a month for the next one. So thank you so much for joining live and on the recording, and see you guys soon.